The condensation from the plastic cup dripped onto my cheap shoes. I stood frozen outside the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite. Inside the room, the man I had married 3 years ago was laughing. It was not the warm, charismatic laugh he used at charity galas or venture capital dinners. It was a cruel, hollow sound. A sound that belonged to a predator who thought he was alone in the dark. The iced coffee in my hand was freezing my fingers through the flimsy plastic. I shifted my weight, feeling the unnatural pinch of the discount store flats I had bought yesterday. The scratchy polyester of my beige blouse clung uncomfortably to my skin. I was used to the whisper of custom silk and the soft embrace of tailored cashmere. But today, I was not Clara Vance. I was not the 51% majority shareholder of Zenith Core, a $10 billion tech empire. Today, I was just a nameless, faceless administrative assistant. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the reality of the moment wash over me. The air conditioning on the 60th floor of the tower was always set to a sterile 68 degrees. It was meant to keep the executives alert, but right now, it was turning the sweat on the back of my neck into ice. Zenith Core was not just a company to me. It was my bloodline. My father had built this empire from a cramped, unventilated garage in the valley. He had poured his life, his brilliant mind, and his failing health into every line of code and every silicon architecture that now powered half the world. I grew up watching him burn the midnight oil, his hands scarred from soldering irons, his eyes heavy with the weight of innovation. When my father passed away, the grief had been a crushing physical weight. I had been 28 years old, suddenly holding the keys to a kingdom I was too devastated to rule. That was when Julian stepped in. Julian was charismatic, sharp, and endlessly patient. Or so I had thought. He was a middle-class climber with a silver tongue and a desperate hunger for the elite circles of Silicon Beach. I had married him because he felt like a safe harbor in a storm of corporate vultures. I had willingly stepped back into the shadows. I chose the quiet life of a devoted wife in our sprawling Bel Air estate. I handed him the operational reins. I made him the chief executive officer. I gave him the world, simply because he asked for it with a gentle smile. But the gentle smiles had slowly vanished over the past year. The late nights at the office had multiplied, and the sudden, unexplained weekend business trips to San Francisco had become a routine. Then came the subtle, undeniable shifts in his behavior. It started with the scent. Julian had always worn a bespoke cedar and bergamot cologne. But 3 months ago, I began catching the faint, lingering odor of synthetic vanilla and cheap amber on his collars. It was a loud, desperate fragrance. It was the kind of perfume worn by someone who needed to be noticed in a crowded room. When I asked him about it, his eyes had turned flat and cold. He told me I was being paranoid. He told me the pressure of the looming Summit Capital buyout was making him work closely with junior marketing staff. He patted my hand, called me his quiet little homebody, and told me to go buy myself something pretty. That was his first fatal mistake. He forgot who he had married. He forgot that beneath my quiet demeanor, I possessed the exact same ruthlessly logical mind as my father. I did not cry. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply began to observe. I realized I could not uncover the truth from the gilded cage of our Bel Air mansion. The sprawling, silent halls and the hidden biometric safes offered no answers. I needed to see him in his natural habitat. I needed to see the man he became when he thought I was safely locked away behind iron gates and manicured hedges. I made a single, encrypted phone call to Evelyn. Evelyn was the veteran director of human resources, and one of the very few people in the building who knew my true face. She was a cautious, middle-aged woman who had been fiercely loyal to my father. When I told Evelyn my plan, she had been terrified. She begged me to just hire a private investigator. She warned me that the corporate culture Julian had cultivated was toxic and ruthless. I refused. A private investigator could only show me photographs. I needed to feel the temperature of the room. I needed to hear the exact words. Evelyn had quietly bypassed the standard background checks and created a ghost profile in the employee database. She assigned me to the floating administrative pool on the lower floors. This morning, I had left the mansion before dawn. I drove my father's old, unassuming sedan instead of my usual armored vehicle. I parked 3 blocks away from the gleaming glass skyscraper. I locked my $200,000 watch in the glove compartment. Walking into the Zenith Core lobby had been a surreal experience. The massive digital screens flashed our stock price. The security guards, who usually snapped to attention when my vehicle approached the private garage, did not even glance at me. I was completely invisible. I spent the first 4 hours of the morning navigating the lower floors. I saw the rigid caste system Julian had implemented. The brilliant engineers, the people actually building the future, were crammed into noisy, open-plan desks. They looked exhausted and demoralized. Meanwhile, the middle management executives strutted around in flashy designer suits. They loudly discussed their leased sports cars and their weekend reservations at exclusive clubs. It was a sickening display of nouveau riche desperation. They were parasites, feeding off the legacy my father had built. At 11 in the morning, the call came down to the admin pool. The chief executive officer required his iced coffee. His personal secretary was too busy to fetch it. The task fell to the nameless new girl. I took the service elevator up to the 60th floor. The doors opened to a completely different world. The chaotic noise of the lower levels vanished. Here, the floors were covered in thick, sound-absorbing carpets. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany. The air smelled of expensive espresso and raw power. I walked slowly down the long corridor. My cheap shoes made no sound on the plush carpet. I held the plastic cup tightly, feeling the ice melt against my palm. I approached the heavy double doors of Julian's private suite. That was when I heard the laugh. I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was open just a fraction of an inch. It was enough to let the voices slip through the crack. A woman was speaking. Her voice was high-pitched, arrogant, and dripping with unearned confidence. I knew instantly who it was: Sloane. Julian's hand-picked personal secretary. She was pacing the room. I could hear the sharp click of her designer heels on the hardwood floor. She was complaining about a vendor, but the conversation quickly shifted. She sighed loudly and asked Julian how much longer she had to play this ridiculous game. Julian's voice answered her. It was smooth, relaxed, and intimately close. He told her to be patient. He told her that the Summit Capital deal was only weeks away from closing. Sloane laughed a cruel, mocking laugh. She asked him how the useless wife at home was handling things. She called me a ghost. She said I was too stupid to even realize what was happening right under my nose. I waited for my husband to defend me. I waited for a shred of guilt or hesitation. Instead, Julian chuckled. The sound made my stomach turn to ash. He called me a brick wall. He said I was a necessary obstacle, a boring, frigid legacy piece that he had to tolerate until the paperwork was finalized. He promised Sloane that once the new valuation was locked in, he would trigger the Delaware shell companies. He explained his plan with terrifying precision. He was quietly transferring the intellectual property rights of our new artificial intelligence chip to a subsidiary controlled by Sloane's family. He was going to gut Zenith Core from the inside out. He promised her that by the end of the year, he would throw me out of the Bel Air estate with nothing but a fraction of my own inheritance. He told her they would own the empire together. I stood in the hallway, listening to the man I loved casually outline my destruction. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel panic. Instead, a profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. The grief evaporated, leaving behind a pure, crystalline rage. I looked down at the plastic cup in my hand. The condensation was dripping steadily. I took a slow, deep breath. I adjusted my cheap glasses. I let my shoulders slump forward, adopting the posture of a terrified, incompetent rookie. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open with my shoulder. I stumbled slightly, letting the ice rattle loudly in the plastic cup. I gasped, pretending to be startled by the weight of the door. The executive suite was bathed in the harsh, bright light of the California sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian was sitting behind his massive desk, leaning back in his leather chair. His tie was loosened. Sloane was perched on the edge of his desk. She was wearing a tight, aggressively branded designer dress that screamed of new money and insecurity. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating scent of synthetic vanilla and amber. They both snapped their heads toward me. The intimate, relaxed atmosphere shattered instantly. Sloane's face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious entitlement. She slid off the desk and marched toward me. She demanded to know who I was and what I was doing in her office. She did not recognize me. To her, I was just a peasant who had wandered into the royal court. I kept my eyes glued to the floor. I stammered, my voice trembling perfectly. I held out the plastic cup, whispering that I was from the admin pool and had brought the chief executive officer his coffee. Sloane snatched the cup from my hand. She sneered at my cheap clothes. She told me I was pathetic. She told me that in the real corporate world, people knock before entering a room. She leaned in close, her breath hot and smelling of mint, and told me she was going to have human resources terminate my contract before lunch. I risked a quick glance at Julian. He was looking at his phone, completely indifferent to the psychological abuse happening 3 feet away from him. He waved his hand dismissively, telling Sloane to just get rid of me so they could finish their meeting. I nodded frantically, apologizing over and over again. I took a step back toward the door. But as I moved, Sloane raised her hand to point a perfectly manicured finger at my face. The bright California sunlight caught her hand. A blinding flash of blue light refracted across the mahogany walls. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. On her right ring finger sat a massive, flawless blue diamond. It was set in a highly intricate, custom platinum band shaped like intertwining ivy. It was not just an expensive piece of jewelry. It was a one-of-a-kind design. I knew every facet of that stone. I knew the exact weight of the platinum. I knew it because I had sketched the design myself 6 months ago. It was meant to be my anniversary gift to Julian. I had commissioned it in absolute secrecy. When it was finished, I had locked it inside the biometric wall safe in our master bedroom. A safe that could only be opened by my fingerprint. My mind raced, calculating the impossible. The only way Julian could have opened that safe was by pressing my sleeping hand against the scanner in the dead of night. He had violated my physical space, stolen my private creation, and given it to his cheap mistress to wear in my own building. I stared at the blue diamond, watching it sparkle on the finger of the woman who was planning to steal my life. The terrified rookie act vanished from my eyes. I looked up slowly, meeting Sloane's arrogant gaze with a stare so cold and hollow it made her falter for a fraction of a second. This was no longer just an affair. This was a calculated, predatory infiltration of my legacy. And as I backed out of the room and let the heavy door click shut, I knew the war had officially begun. The hallway outside the executive suite was a blur of polished marble and rushing assistants, but my mind was perfectly, terrifyingly still. I walked toward the glass elevators, my cheap, sensible shoes making no sound on the imported stone. Every step I took was a calculation. Julian had not just cheated on me. He had drugged me with complacency, waited until I was deeply asleep, and pressed my unconscious hand against a biometric scanner to steal a diamond that belonged to my family legacy. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 6th floor. The descent was smooth, silent, and entirely too fast. I watched the floor numbers tick down on the digital display, feeling the last remnants of my former life burning away. I was no longer the supportive wife waiting in a Bel Air mansion. I was the majority shareholder of a $10 billion empire, and my building had been infested. The Zenith Core cafeteria was not a simple dining hall. It was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar ecosystem designed to keep our engineers fed and our executives segregated. I stepped out of the elevator and into the cavernous space. The air was thick with the smell of artisanal espresso, roasted garlic, and the relentless hum of 1,000 high-stress conversations. To my left were the long, communal wooden tables where the junior developers and administrative staff sat shoulder to shoulder. To my right, elevated by 3 shallow steps and bordered by frosted glass, was the executive lounge. It was a physical manifestation of the corporate caste system Julian had installed. I moved through the crowd, picking up a standard plastic tray from the stack near the entrance. My eyes locked onto the VIP section. Sloane was holding court. She sat in the center of a curved white leather booth, surrounded by 3 mid-level vice presidents. They were men who made high 6-figure salaries, yet they were leaning in, laughing entirely too hard at whatever she was saying. She was basking in the glow of borrowed power. She wore a tailored designer blouse that cost more than the monthly rent of the junior developers sitting 50 feet away. And then, I saw it. Resting on the polished mahogany table, right next to her manicured hand, was a matte black, custom-engraved Yeti mug. It was not just any mug. I had commissioned that exact piece for Julian on our 2nd anniversary. I had the exact geographic coordinates of the cramped Silicon Valley garage where my father founded Zenith Core laser-etched into the steel. It was a sacred artifact of my family history. It represented the blood, the sweat, and the generational legacy that built the very floor she was sitting on. And Julian had given it to his secretary to use for her morning iced lattes. A cold, absolute calm washed over my entire body. The ambient noise of the cafeteria seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar. I did not hesitate. I did not slow my pace. I walked directly toward the frosted glass barrier and stepped up the 3 shallow stairs into the restricted executive lounge. The 3 vice presidents stopped laughing the moment I approached. They looked at my cheap beige cardigan and my unbranded slacks with open, unfiltered disgust. I was a peasant trespassing in their sanctuary. Sloane did not even look up from her phone until my shadow fell completely over her table. I set my plastic tray down on the polished mahogany surface. The sound was sharp and out of place. I reached out, picked up the matte black mug, and took a slow, deliberate sip of the iced coffee inside. The silence that fell over the booth was absolute. The vice presidents stared at me in sheer paralyzed disbelief. A lowly administrative assistant had just walked into the VIP section, interrupted the CEO's personal secretary, and drank from her cup. Sloane looked at me, her eyes widening in a mixture of profound shock and pure, unadulterated rage. She stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. She screamed at me, demanding to know what the hell I thought I was doing. Her voice cracked like a whip across the quiet hum of the cafeteria. Hundreds of heads turned toward the executive lounge. The clinking of silverware stopped. The espresso machines seemed to fall silent. I placed the mug back on the table, setting it down exactly where I had found it. I looked her dead in the eye, my expression completely blank. I told her the coffee was stale. Sloane lost her mind. The fragile veneer of corporate professionalism shattered instantly. She swept her arm across the table, violently smashing my plastic tray onto the floor. The sound of shattering ceramic plates echoed like a gunshot through the massive room. Before I could even blink, she lunged forward. She raised her hand and slapped me across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The crack of her palm against my cheek was deafening. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the impact. A sharp, stinging heat bloomed instantly across my skin, radiating down to my jaw. The entire cafeteria went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop in a room of 1,000 people. No one moved. No one breathed. Sloane stood over me, her chest heaving, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. She screamed that I was a pathetic nobody. She screamed that she ran this floor, that she controlled this company, and that the CEO was her man. She promised to have me thrown out on the street before the hour was up. I did not touch my face. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head back to center and looked at her. I let the silence stretch, letting her psychotic outburst hang in the air for everyone to witness. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors at the far end of the cafeteria swung open. Julian rushed in, flanked by 2 massive security guards. He had clearly been alerted to a physical altercation in the executive lounge. He strode forward, his face set in a mask of authoritative annoyance. He was ready to play the corporate hero, ready to protect his territory. He pushed through the crowd of paralyzed employees, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He stepped up into the VIP section, his eyes locking onto Sloane first. Then, his gaze shifted to me. He saw the cheap clothes. He saw the shattered plates scattered across the floor. And he saw the bright, angry red handprint blooming across the cheek of his billionaire wife. The authoritative mask melted off his face in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by absolute, soul-crushing terror. Julian stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse standing in a tailored suit. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes darted wildly between me and Sloane. He was staring at the woman who owned 51% of the company he was trying to steal, standing in the middle of his cafeteria, having just been physically assaulted by his mistress. Sloane did not notice his paralysis. She was too blinded by her own arrogance. She grabbed Julian by the arm, her voice dripping with venomous entitlement. She demanded that he fire me immediately. She told him I was a deranged psycho who had attacked her, and she wanted security to drag me out of the building by my hair. She looked at Julian expectantly, waiting for him to destroy me. She waited for her powerful man to validate her dominance. I looked at Julian. My eyes locked onto his terrified, trembling gaze. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a crisp, icy articulation that carried effortlessly through the silent room. I told Sloane that she was deeply mistaken. I told her that she did not run this floor. I told her she did not own that mug. And I told her she certainly did not own the man standing next to her. I called her exactly what she was. A cheap, temporary distraction who had vastly overestimated her own value. Julian panicked. The primal instinct for self-preservation overrode everything else in his brain. He knew that if I spoke another word, if I revealed my true identity right then and there, his entire empire would burn to the ground. He violently ripped his arm out of Sloane's grasp. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging brutally into her silk blouse. He did not look at me. He could not bring himself to meet my eyes. He physically dragged her away from the table. Sloane shrieked in confusion, fighting against his grip. She demanded to know what he was doing. Julian hissed at her to shut her mouth. He dragged his hysterical mistress out of the executive lounge, pushing through the sea of staring employees, and shoved her through the glass doors. The cafeteria remained frozen in stunned silence. The 3 vice presidents were staring at me as if I were a ghost. I calmly bent down, picked up the largest piece of my shattered tray, placed it on the table, and walked away. I made it to the 4th floor corridor before a hand grabbed my arm and pulled me into an empty, unlit conference room. It was Evelyn, the director of human resources. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking violently. She locked the door behind us and turned to me, her eyes wide with panic. She told me I had to leave the building immediately. She said Sloane was dangerous, that Julian protected her at all costs, and that I was going to be professionally and legally destroyed if I stayed. She begged me to just walk away and find another job. I looked at Evelyn, feeling a brief flash of pity for her ignorance. She was a good woman trapped in a toxic system, entirely unaware that she was speaking to the architect of the building. I reached into the pocket of my cheap cardigan and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen. The crystal-clear audio of Sloane screaming obscenities filled the small conference room. The sound of the shattering plates echoed from the speaker, followed immediately by the sharp, violent crack of the slap. I had recorded the entire assault. Evelyn stared at the phone, her mouth falling open. I turned off the recording and slipped the device back into my pocket. I looked at her and told her I was not the one who needed to flee. I thanked her for her concern, unlocked the door, and stepped back out into the hallway. It was time to stop playing the victim. It was time to open the armory. I bypassed the main elevators and walked toward the restricted service corridor. I took the freight elevator down to the sub-basement. This was a level Julian rarely visited. It was a concrete bunker that housed the legacy physical servers and the dusty paper archives from the early days of Zenith Core. The air down here was freezing. It smelled of ozone, copper wiring, and old paper. I walked past rows of humming server racks, moving to the very back of the room. I stopped in front of a heavy steel door secured by a biometric keypad and a retinal scanner. Julian thought he controlled the digital infrastructure of my company. He thought his newly hired cybersecurity team had locked down every vulnerability. He was wrong. My father had built Zenith Core from the ground up. Before he died, he had hardwired a supreme-level backdoor access into the physical architecture of the building. It was a ghost protocol that bypassed every firewall, every encryption key. I pressed my thumb against the scanner and leaned in for the retinal sweep. The machine whirred softly. A second later, the light flashed green and the heavy steel door clicked open. I stepped into the master terminal room. It was a small, windowless space dominated by a sleek black console. I sat down in the leather chair, the cold air biting through my thin cardigan. I woke the terminal and typed in a string of command codes my father had made me memorize when I was 20 years old. The screen flared to life, casting a pale blue glow across my face. I was now inside the central nervous system of a $10 billion empire. I had unrestricted access to every email, every financial transaction, and every hidden file in the building. I began the financial forensics. I did not need a team of accountants. I had been reading balance sheets since I was a teenager. It did not take long to find the rot. Julian had been incredibly busy. I uncovered a massive, sprawling web of embezzlement, hidden beneath layers of fabricated vendor contracts and artificially inflated consulting fees. Millions of dollars were bleeding out of Zenith Core's operational budget every single quarter. I traced the money. The funds were not going to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Julian was arrogant, but he was also lazy. The money was being funneled into a series of shell companies registered in Delaware. I pulled the incorporation documents for the shell companies. The registered agents were not anonymous corporate lawyers. They were members of Sloane's immediate family. Her brother, her father. Julian was using his mistress's family to launder my money. But the financial theft was not the kill shot. Embezzlement was a crime, but I needed absolute, undeniable destruction. I dug deeper into Julian's personal encrypted server space. I found a hidden folder labeled with a string of random dates. I ran the decryption protocol, shattering his pathetic security password in less than 30 seconds. Inside the folder was a collection of high-definition video files. I clicked on the most recent one. The video was recorded from a hidden camera. The angle was low, likely positioned inside a briefcase. The setting was a private dining room at a high-end steakhouse in Beverly Hills. Julian was sitting at a heavy oak table with 3 aggressive venture capitalists from Summit Capital. He was drinking expensive scotch, his tie loosened, laughing with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. And then, he laid out his entire hostile takeover plot. I sat in the freezing server room and listened to my husband detail exactly how he planned to gut my company. He explained how he was artificially depressing the quarterly earnings by hiding revenue in the Delaware shell companies. He was doing this to force a panic among the minority shareholders. He promised the venture capitalists that once the valuation dropped, they could swoop in, buy out the panicked board members, dilute my majority stake, and strip me of my inheritance. One of the investors asked about me. He asked if Clara Vance would be a problem. Julian laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound. He looked directly toward the hidden camera and called me a naive, useless housewife. He said I was too busy decorating the Bel Air mansion to ever understand a balance sheet. He promised them I would never see the blade coming until it was already in my back. I watched the video twice. I felt no tears. I felt no heartbreak. The woman who loved Julian had died the moment I saw that blue diamond ring on Sloane's finger. I only felt the cold, mechanical precision of a guillotine being raised into position. I connected a heavily encrypted flash drive to the terminal. I downloaded every single file. The bank records, the shell company incorporation documents, the fabricated vendor contracts, and the hidden camera footage. I pulled the drive from the port, feeling the weight of Julian's absolute destruction resting in the palm of my hand. I left the building through the underground parking garage, avoiding the main lobby entirely. I got into my car and drove straight to Century City. I bypassed the reception desk and took the private elevator up to the penthouse offices of Zenith Core's independent legal counsel. Harrison was waiting for me. Harrison was a veteran corporate attorney. He was a silver-haired shark in a bespoke suit, a man who had been my father's fiercest loyalist and closest friend. He was the only person in Los Angeles who knew exactly what I was capable of. I walked into his massive corner office and dropped the encrypted flash drive onto his oak desk. He took one look at the red mark still fading on my cheek, and his eyes darkened. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew better. He simply plugged the drive into his secure terminal and began to read. We spent 4 hours in his office. We did not prepare a defense, we prepared an execution. We drafted the emergency board resolutions. We drafted the immediate termination papers for Julian and Sloan. We drafted the criminal referral documents for the FBI, detailing the wire fraud, the embezzlement, and the conspiracy to defraud investors. Harrison reviewed the hidden camera footage. He watched Julian laugh about stealing my inheritance. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at me across the desk. He told me Julian was looking at a minimum of 15 years in federal prison. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Los Angeles skyline. I told Harrison that 15 years was a good start. The sun had already set when I finally drove back to the Bel Air estate. The sprawling mansion was completely silent, shrouded in the heavy darkness of the hills. The massive iron gates closed behind my car with a heavy final thud. I walked through the front door, my heels clicking sharply against the imported marble foyer. The house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a home. It was a museum dedicated to a marriage that had never actually existed. It was a crime scene. Julian was waiting for me in the formal living room. He was pacing back and forth in front of the unlit fireplace, holding a heavy crystal glass of scotch. When he saw me enter the room, he immediately launched into his pathetic, rehearsed performance. He rushed forward, his face twisted into a mask of desperate, agonizing concern. He tried to reach out and touch my face, playing the victim. He claimed he had absolutely no idea Sloan was so unstable. He swore to me that she was just an overly aggressive assistant who had developed a delusional, one-sided obsession with him. He promised me he had already suspended her pending a full investigation. He said he was going to handle the situation quietly to protect my reputation and the company's stock price. He spoke with the smooth, practiced rhythm of a sociopath who truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. He thought I was just a terrified housewife who had stumbled into a messy office drama. I did not say a single word. I did not pull away from him. I simply reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. The envelope slid across the smooth surface and spilled open. Dozens of high-resolution surveillance photos scattered across the glass. Photos of Julian and Sloan entering luxury hotels in downtown Los Angeles, photos of the custom blue diamond ring on her finger, photos of the Delaware Incorporation documents bearing her family's name, and a printed transcript of his conversation with the venture capitalists at the steakhouse. Julian stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked down at the table. The glass of scotch in his hand began to tremble, the amber liquid sloshing against the crystal. He slowly looked back up at me. The mask of the concerned, loving husband melted away completely. The silence in the massive living room became suffocating, heavy with the weight of absolute exposure. He realized in that exact fraction of a second that I knew everything. I knew about the affair. I knew about the money. I knew about the hostile takeover. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. Julian did not apologize. He did not fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. He dropped the nice guy act entirely. His posture shifted, his shoulders squaring as a dark, violent rage overtook his features. He slammed his glass down on the table, shattering the crystal base. He took a step toward me, his physical presence suddenly towering and deeply threatening. The charismatic CEO was gone. The monster underneath had finally come out to play. He pointed a finger inches from my face and unleashed a torrent of vicious, unfiltered abuse. He told me I was absolutely nothing without him. He claimed he was the only reason Zenith Corp was a $10 billion company, and that my father was a dinosaur who would have bankrupted the firm. He threatened to drag my name through the mud in the press. He threatened to tie up my assets in endless litigation for decades. He swore he would leave me absolutely penniless, living on the street, if I dared to cross him. He demanded I submit to his authority, sign over my voting rights, and let him handle the business. I looked at the vein pulsing violently in his neck. I looked at the spit flying from his lips, and I laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the mansion. I did not step back. I stepped directly into his space, forcing him to look down at me. I told him he had until noon tomorrow to officially fire Sloan and return every single stolen dollar to the corporate accounts. I did not wait for his response. I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy oak front doors. He screamed my name, his voice cracking with violent fury, demanding I come back and face him. I ignored him. I pulled open the door and stepped out into the cool, damp Los Angeles night. I walked down the stone driveway toward my car, the sound of his rage muffled by the thick walls of the estate. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my phone. A tiny, hidden red light was blinking steadily on the screen. I had recorded every single second of his violent extortion attempt. The trap was perfectly set, and tomorrow the jaws would snap shut. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the leather cold against my skin, and watched the blinking red light for a long, silent moment. The audio file was saved, heavily encrypted, and automatically backed up to 3 separate secure servers located in different time zones. Julian was still screaming inside the mansion. His voice was a pathetic, muffled echo against the reinforced glass of the front windows. He was demanding that I come back inside. He was demanding that I submit to his authority. He was a man who had spent 3 years believing he was the master of my universe, completely unaware that he was merely a guest in my house. I started the engine. The low, powerful purr of the motor felt like the heartbeat of a predator waking from a very long sleep. I put the car in gear and drove down the winding, manicured roads of Bel Air. I was leaving the gilded cage behind me forever. I did not sleep that night. I drove to a discreet, ultra-luxury hotel in downtown Los Angeles. It was a place where the staff asked absolutely no questions, and the walls were thick enough to block out the relentless noise of the city. I checked into the penthouse suite under a corporate alias. I spent the hours between midnight and dawn sitting at a heavy mahogany desk, bathed in the cold light of my laptop screen. I was reviewing every single document Harrison had prepared. The legal guillotine was sharpened to a microscopic edge. I traced my finger over the digital bank statements, the offshore wire transfers, and the forged executive signatures. Julian had been incredibly sloppy. He had let his arrogance blind him to the massive digital footprints he was leaving across the Zenith Core servers. He truly believed he was a corporate mastermind. In reality, he was nothing more than a common thief with a good haircut and a sociopathic charm. When the sun finally rose over the smog-choked skyline of Los Angeles, I stood up and walked to the massive walk-in closet. The cheap, ill-fitting polyester blouses and scuffed flat shoes I had worn as an administrative assistant were gone. I had thrown them into the incinerator chute of the hotel. They had served their purpose. In their place hung a bespoke, deep burgundy power suit. It had been tailored to absolute perfection in Milan. It was a piece of armor forged in the quiet, untouchable world of old money tech royalty. I slipped it on. The heavy, expensive fabric moved with me like a second skin of pure authority. I fastened a vintage gold watch around my wrist. It was a heavy, mechanical timepiece that had belonged to my father. It was not flashy. It did not scream for attention like the gaudy, diamond-encrusted monstrosities Julian and Sloan favored. It was a quiet, devastating statement of generational legacy. I looked at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The terrified, submissive housewife was dead. The lowly, invisible administrative assistant was dead. Clara Vance, the majority shareholder of a $10 billion empire, was looking back at me. Her eyes were icy, unblinking, and ready for absolute war. I picked up my leather briefcase. It contained the physical copies of the destruction I was about to unleash. I left the hotel and drove toward Silicon Beach. The morning traffic was a slow, crawling river of metal and exhaust, but I felt absolutely no impatience. I had all the time in the world. Julian's time, however, was rapidly running out. I pulled into the private, subterranean parking garage of the Zenith Core Tower. I bypassed the crowded employee levels entirely. I drove straight down to the restricted executive tier behind a secondary security gate. I parked my car in the oversized spot, reserved exclusively for the chairman of the board. It had been empty since the day my father died. I turned off the engine and picked up my phone. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. I opened my encrypted email client. Harrison had drafted the necessary corporate communications the night before. I selected the first email. It was a formal, immediate termination notice for Sloan. It cited gross misconduct, corporate espionage, and severe violations of her non-disclosure agreements. It explicitly stated that her security clearance was revoked immediately. I pressed send. I selected the second email. It was an emergency, mandatory summons to the Zenith Core Board of Directors. It utilized a supreme-level founder override code that bypassed Julian's authority entirely. It mandated their physical presence in the top-floor boardroom at 9 o'clock sharp. I pressed send. The digital missiles were launched. The blast wave was already ripping through the building above me. I stepped out of the car. The underground garage was silent. The air smelled of expensive exhaust fumes and damp concrete. I walked toward the private executive elevator. The security guard stationed at the subterranean desk looked up from his monitors. His hand instinctively reached for his radio. He was used to seeing me in oversized sweaters, nervously dropping off dry cleaning for the chief executive officer. He did not recognize the woman in the burgundy suit walking toward him with the measured, lethal stride of an apex predator. I did not slow down. I did not break eye contact. I held up my father's black, solid metal biometric access card. The guard's eyes widened in absolute shock. He swallowed hard. He stepped back and lowered his hand, his posture instantly shifting into submission. I swiped the heavy metal card against the scanner. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the 50th floor. The elevator shot upward, leaving the subterranean darkness behind. Through the glass back of the cab, the sprawling, sun-drenched expanse of Los Angeles revealed itself. The city looked like a massive, glittering circuit board. My father had built his empire in a cramped, unair-conditioned garage. He had soldered wires until his fingers bled. He had built this company on actual, groundbreaking innovation. He had built it on sleepless nights and a relentless pursuit of the future. Julian was trying to sell that sacred legacy to the highest bidder. He was gutting the engineering departments to artificially inflate the stock price for a ruthless venture capital buyout. He was a parasite feeding on my family's blood. The elevator passed the 30th floor, the 40th floor, the 45th floor. My heart rate did not elevate. My breathing remained slow, deep, and perfectly controlled. I was a machine executing a flawless, irreversible program. The elevator chimed again. The doors parted. I stepped out onto the 50th floor. The atmosphere was completely different from the bustling, chaotic energy of the lower administrative levels. Up here, the air was hushed. It was thick with the scent of expensive leather, polished mahogany, and millions of dollars in silent, daily transactions. I walked down the long, glass-walled corridor. Secretaries and junior executives paused mid-sentence as I passed. They stared, they whispered behind their hands. They felt the sudden, terrifying shift in the atmospheric pressure, even if they did not yet understand the cause. I approached the heavy double doors of the main boardroom. Julian's new executive assistant was sitting at the desk outside. He was a nervous young man who had replaced Sloan after her spectacular, violent meltdown in the cafeteria yesterday. He was frantically typing on his keyboard, his face pale with panic. He looked up as I approached. He stammered, holding up his hands. He tried to tell me that the boardroom was strictly closed. He tried to say that an unauthorized emergency meeting had been called and that I absolutely could not go in there. I did not even look at him. I did not acknowledge his existence. I placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the door. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. They swung inward with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed like a gunshot. The boardroom was a cavernous, intimidating space. It was dominated by a massive, custom-built table carved from a single slab of reclaimed redwood. The entire board of directors was seated around it, 12 men and women. They were the titans of Silicon Beach. They were the financial guardians of Zenith Core. At the head of the table stood Julian. He was mid-sentence. His face was flushed with a dark, ugly anger. He was holding a printed copy of the emergency summons I had just sent. He was demanding to know who had authorized the meeting. He was screaming at the chief financial officer, demanding to know who had bypassed his supreme security clearance. He stopped speaking the exact moment I walked in. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a catastrophic physical impact. Julian stared at me. His eyes darted over my tailored burgundy suit. They darted over my immaculate hair. They locked onto the cold, dead expression on my face. For a split second, his brain simply could not process the visual information. He was looking for the weak, weeping woman he had terrorized and threatened the night before. He was looking for the pathetic, invisible administrative assistant he had mocked with his mistress. He found neither. Victor sat near the middle of the long table. He was the vice chairman of the board and my father's oldest, most loyal friend. His silver hair caught the morning light pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked at me. His eyes narrowed in deep confusion for a moment, and then, slowly, they widened in profound, glorious realization. A tiny, dangerous smile touched the corner of Victor's mouth. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and crossed his arms. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Julian finally found his voice. It was a harsh, panicked bark that cracked in the middle. He pointed a trembling finger at me. He ordered me to leave the room immediately. He looked around at the board members, trying to force a laugh. He called me his hysterical wife. He claimed I was having a severe mental breakdown. He shouted for the executive assistant to call security. He demanded that the armed guards remove this crazy woman from the premises before she embarrassed herself further. I did not blink. I did not stop walking. I moved slowly and deliberately toward the empty chair at the opposite end of the long redwood table. It was the chair that legally belonged to the majority shareholder. I carried the thick, black leather binder under my arm. I reached the chair. I did not sit down. I stood behind it, resting my hands lightly on the high leather back. I looked directly down the length of the table into Julian's terrified, sweating face. I spoke. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the massive room like a surgical scalpel through soft tissue. I told Julian to sit down and shut his mouth. The sheer, icy authority in my tone was absolute. Two of the junior board members physically flinched in their seats. Julian's jaw dropped open. He looked around the room, desperately waiting for someone to defend him. He waited for someone to enforce his authority. No one moved. No one breathed. I opened the black leather binder. I let the heavy cover fall flat against the polished wood with a sharp, cracking sound. I looked at the 12 faces staring at me. I formally introduced myself. I told them my name was Clara Vance. I told them I was the only daughter of the founder. I told them I was the legal, undisputed owner of 51% of the voting shares of Zenith Core. And I told them I was the woman who was about to save this $10 billion company from the parasitic rot currently standing at the head of the table. The room erupted. Several board members started talking at once. They demanded explanations. They looked from me to Julian in absolute, paralyzed shock. The chief financial officer stood up, his face pale. Victor slammed his heavy hand down on the table. His voice boomed over the chaos, demanding immediate silence. He looked at me. His eyes were shining with a fierce, protective pride. He told the board that I had the floor. He told them that anyone who interrupted me would be removed from the room. I nodded to Victor in acknowledgement. I reached into the binder. I pulled out 12 thick, perfectly bound dossiers. I slid them down the length of the polished redwood table. I instructed the board members to open them to page 1. I began to speak. My voice was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of absolute destruction. I did not use emotion. I used raw data. I used verified facts. I used the cold, hard mathematics of corporate treason. I walked them through the first section of the dossier. I detailed the exact dates, times, and dollar amounts of Julian's massive embezzlement. I read out the specific routing numbers of the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I explained the complex, illegal web of shell companies registered in the state of Delaware. I revealed that every single one of these fictitious companies was set up under the maiden name of Sloane's mother. I provided the forged vendor invoices. I provided the inflated server space billing records. I watched the blood completely drain from Julian's face. He gripped the edges of the redwood table. His knuckles turned stark white. He tried to interrupt me. He tried to claim the documents were elaborate forgeries. He tried to say it was a massive misunderstanding. He claimed it was a highly complex tax mitigation strategy that had been fully approved by the former chief financial officer. I did not let him finish his pathetic lie. I cut him off. My voice sliced through his panic. I told him the former chief financial officer was currently sitting in a windowless room with my lead attorney, Harrison. I told him the man was signing a full, unredacted confession in exchange for federal immunity. Victor flipped through the pages of the dossier. His reading glasses were perched on the end of his nose. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He looked up at Julian. The disgust in his eyes was absolute and terrifying. Victor had built this company with my father. He had slept under his desk in the early days when they could not afford rent. He viewed Zenith Core as a sacred, unbreakable trust. He slammed the dossier shut. The sound echoed off the glass walls. Victor leaned forward. He asked Julian, his voice trembling with barely contained rage, how he could possibly justify stealing $30 million from the Advanced Research and Development Fund. He asked him how he could look the board in the eye while secretly gutting the very heart of the engineering division. Julian was sweating profusely now. The collar of his expensive, custom-tailored shirt was completely soaked. He looked like a cornered rat frantically searching for a drain to crawl into. Julian tried one last, desperate maneuver. He stood up violently, knocking his heavy leather chair backward onto the carpet. He pointed at me and screamed that I was clinically insane. He claimed I was a jealous, bitter housewife trying to ruin his brilliant career because of a minor marital dispute. He looked at the board members. He begged them not to listen to a woman who knew absolutely nothing about the tech industry. He claimed I had spent the last 3 years hiding in a mansion, completely detached from reality. He swore on his life that his only goal was to secure the $10 billion valuation and protect the shareholders' investments. I let him finish. I let the pathetic echo of his desperate lies fade into the heavy, suffocating silence of the boardroom. I did not argue with him. I did not defend my intelligence. I simply reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my phone. I walked over to the digital control panel embedded in the mahogany wall. I plugged my phone directly into the master projection system. I tapped the screen once. The massive, high-definition monitor at the front of the boardroom flickered to life. The automated blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows instantly lowered, plunging the room into a cinematic darkness. The video began to play. It was the hidden camera footage I had extracted from the Supreme-level backdoor digital archive. It was the footage Julian arrogantly thought he had permanently deleted from the mainframe. The massive screen showed Julian sitting in this exact boardroom. It was late at night. He had a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. He was talking to a representative from Summit Capital, the most ruthless, predatory venture capital firm on the West Coast. The audio was crystal clear. It echoed through the acoustic dampening of the room. The board watched in horrified, paralyzed silence as the digital version of Julian laid out his entire, sickening plan. They heard him laugh. They heard him call the senior engineering team a bunch of useless, overpaid nerds. They heard him detail his exact strategy to artificially inflate the daily active user metrics. They heard him explain how he would secure the buyout, cash out his massive stock options, and leave Zenith Core to be carved up and sold for scrap metal. He was bragging about destroying their life's work. And then came the final, devastating blow. They heard him talk about me. They heard him call his wife a stupid, trusting cow. They heard him say he was going to systematically drain my family's private accounts. They heard him outline his plan to have me locked in a private psychiatric facility so he could take total, uncontested control of my voting shares. I stopped the video. I unplugged my phone. The automated blinds slowly rose, and the morning light flooded back into the room. The silence was deafening. It was the sound of a man's entire existence being vaporized into dust. I looked at Julian. He was no longer standing. He had collapsed back into his chair. His mouth was hanging open, but absolutely no sound came out. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. He was completely, utterly destroyed. The charismatic, untouchable chief executive officer was gone. The arrogant manipulator was dead. All that was left was a hollow, terrified shell of a man waiting for the federal authorities to arrive. Victor stood up. He did not yell. He did not scream. He simply looked down at Julian and told him he was a disgusting disgrace to the human race. He told him the federal authorities had already been notified and were currently waiting in the lobby. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors burst open. The violent sound shattered the tense silence of the room. Sloane stood in the doorway. She looked like a deranged, rabid animal. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled and torn at the shoulder. Her hair was a tangled, chaotic mess. Her makeup was smeared across her face in dark, ugly streaks. She was clutching her phone in her hand. Her eyes were wild, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. She had just received the termination email. She had stormed past the security desk, completely ignoring the 12 shocked executives sitting at the table. She marched straight toward Julian. She screamed at him. Her voice was shrill, hysterical, and piercing. She demanded to know why her biometric keycard was deactivated. She demanded to know why the lobby security guards had tried to physically stop her from entering the elevator. She ordered Julian to fix the situation immediately. She ordered him to fire whoever had sent the email. Julian slowly lifted his head. He looked at Sloane. He looked at the woman he had risked a $10 billion empire for. He looked at the woman he had bought custom blue diamonds for. He did not see a lover. He did not see a partner. He saw a convenient scapegoat. He saw his only remaining, desperate chance at survival. Julian stood up. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Sloane's face. He shouted that she was the mastermind behind the entire operation. He looked at the board members and frantically claimed that Sloane had seduced him. He claimed she had manipulated his emotions. He swore that her family had set up the Delaware shell companies completely without his knowledge. He claimed he was a helpless victim of her vicious extortion. Sloane stopped screaming. She froze. Her eyes widened in absolute, horrifying disbelief. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She looked at Julian. She looked at the terrified, pathetic man who was actively trying to throw her to the federal wolves to save his own skin. Then, she looked at the massive monitor at the front of the room. The paused frame of the hidden camera video was still visible. She saw the Summit Capital logo on the screen. She saw the timestamp. She realized, in that exact split second, that Julian had been planning to cut her out of the buyout deal entirely. She realized he had been using her just as ruthlessly as he had used me. She realized she was going to federal prison for a man who despised her. A guttural, animalistic scream ripped from her throat. It did not sound human. She lunged at Julian. She crossed the distance between them in a fraction of a second. Her hands were raised. Her manicured nails were aimed straight for his eyes. She slammed into him with the force of a derailed train. She knocked him backward over his heavy leather chair. They crashed to the floor in a violent tangle of limbs, expensive clothing, and pure hatred. Sloane was shrieking. She was tearing at his face. She was punching him in the chest with closed fists. Julian was screaming in high-pitched pain. He was desperately trying to protect his face, slapping her away blindly, begging for someone to help him. It was a pathetic, deeply disgusting display. It was two parasites violently turning on each other the exact moment the host body finally fought back. I stood at the end of the long redwood table. I watched them bleed on the expensive carpet. I felt absolutely nothing. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow for the death of my marriage. I felt only the cold, clinical, deeply satisfying relief of a successful extermination. The boardroom doors opened again. This time, it was not a panicked secretary. It was a team of 6 private security contractors. They were led by the head of Zenith Corps' Internal Defense Division. They rushed into the room. They grabbed Sloane by the arms and violently hauled her off Julian's bleeding body. She kicked. She spat. She screamed vile obscenities, threatening to kill every single person in the room. 2 massive guards dragged her out into the hallway. Julian was left lying on the floor. His nose was bleeding heavily onto the carpet. His custom shirt was torn open, revealing his chest. 2 more guards reached down and hauled him roughly to his feet. They did not treat him like a chief executive officer. They treated him like a dangerous trespasser. They dragged him out of the boardroom. His expensive leather shoes dragged uselessly against the floor. He did not look back at me. The heavy doors closed behind them. The trash had finally been taken out. I turned my attention back to the board of directors. They were all staring at me. They were breathing heavily, their minds struggling to process the extreme violence and the massive financial revelations of the last 15 minutes. I walked slowly around the table. I took the seat at the head of the table, the seat that belonged to my father. The leather was still warm from Julian's panic, but I did not care. I sat down. I folded my hands neatly on the polished wood. I looked directly at Victor. I formally proposed a board motion to immediately remove Julian from all executive positions. I proposed we strip him of his board seat, terminate his contract with extreme prejudice, and freeze every single one of his company-issued financial assets. Victor seconded the motion instantly. His voice was loud and firm. I called for a vote. The vote was unanimous. 12 hands went up in the air without a single second of hesitation. I did not stop there. I proposed a second motion. I appointed Victor as the interim chairman of the board, effective immediately. Victor nodded slowly. A grim, satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. Then, I proposed the final, most important motion. I appointed myself as the interim chief executive officer of Zenith Corps. I looked around the table. I told them I was taking the operational reins of my father's company. I told them I was going to personally oversee the forensic audit of every single department. I told them I was going to fly to New York tomorrow morning. I was going to sit down with Summit Capital and secure the investment myself. I was going to do it using actual, verified engineering data, not Julian's fabricated, fraudulent metrics. I asked if there were any objections to my appointment. The room was dead silent. The motion passed unanimously. The empire was finally mine again. The federal justice system usually moves slowly, but when it is fueled by millions of dollars in private forensic accounting and undeniable, high-definition video evidence, it moves with a crushing, inescapable certainty. The trial was an absolute media spectacle. The financial press dubbed it the Silicon Beach slaughter. Julian desperately tried to hire the best white-collar defense attorneys in the country. But his assets were completely frozen. His reputation was incredibly toxic. No respectable firm would touch him. He was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who looked exhausted before the trial even began. Sloane tried to cut a desperate plea deal by offering to testify against Julian, but the federal prosecutors simply laughed at her. They did not need her testimony. They had the digital backdoor archives. They had the audio recordings. They had the wire transfer receipts. They had absolutely everything. 6 months later, the federal judge handed down the sentences. Julian stood in the courtroom wearing a cheap, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. The arrogant, charismatic charm was completely gone. He looked 10 years older. His hair was thinning rapidly. His posture was stooped and defeated. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and massive embezzlement. He did not look back at the gallery as the armed bailiffs led him away in handcuffs. Sloane fared no better. Her hysterical, screaming outbursts in the courtroom only alienated the jury and angered the judge. She was sentenced to 10 years in a federal women's correctional facility. The custom blue diamond ring she had flaunted so proudly was seized by the government. It was auctioned off to help pay back the stolen corporate funds. They were entirely erased from the world of wealth and power. They were locked away in concrete boxes where their manipulation, their vanity, and their greed meant absolutely nothing. 1 year later, the Los Angeles Convention Center was packed to absolute capacity. 5,000 journalists, tech analysts, and industry titans sat in the darkened auditorium. The air hummed with intense anticipation. The massive digital screens behind the stage pulsed with a deep electric blue light. I stood in the wings, waiting for my cue. I was wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored black suit. My father's vintage gold watch rested securely on my wrist. The company was no longer bleeding. The parasitic rot had been completely cut out. We had secured the Summit Capital investment on our own terms. We had doubled our research and development budget. We had purged the executive floor of every single one of Julian's useless sycophants. Zenith Core was stronger, faster, and infinitely more ruthless than it had ever been before. The dramatic music swelled. The unseen announcer called my name. I walked out onto the brightly lit stage. The applause was deafening. It washed over me like a massive physical wave. I walked to the center of the stage and looked out at the sea of faces. I did not smile. I did not wave. I projected absolute, unshakable authority. I raised my hand. The massive auditorium fell instantly silent. I tapped the remote in my hand. The screens behind me shifted. They revealed the sleek, microscopic architecture of the Nexus artificial intelligence chip. It was the most advanced piece of hardware the world had ever seen. It was the culmination of my father's lifelong dream. It had been brought to life by the brilliant, dedicated engineers Julian had tried to discard like garbage. I began to speak. My voice echoed through the massive hall. It was crisp, highly articulate, and psychologically piercing. I did not talk about the scandal. I did not mention Julian's name. He was a ghost. He was a pathetic footnote in the history of my empire. I talked about resilience. I talked about the brutal, unforgiving nature of true innovation. I told the audience that true power is never given. It is not inherited through a convenient marriage. It is not stolen in the dark by cowards. True power is built. It is engineered through cold logic. It is protected by constant vigilance, and it is sustained by an absolute iron will. I looked directly into the camera lens that was broadcasting the event, live to millions of viewers around the world. I delivered the final, undeniable truth. I told them that a woman's greatest protection in this world is not a gilded cage, and it is certainly not a man. Her greatest protection is her own brilliant mind. It is her absolute economic independence. And it is her unwavering willingness to burn the entire world down to protect what is rightfully hers. The crowd erupted into a massive standing ovation. I stood in the center of the stage, bathed in the blinding, triumphant light of the flashbulbs. The war was over. I had won.